それでは時間が来ましたので、始めたいと思います。So I will begin today's the 17th handai metaphysica special research meeting. So today we have three guest speakers. The first is George Di Giovanni, Professor Giovanni from Mcgill University. I'll introduce you something about Professor Di Giovanni. So he is he's a researcher of German philosophy, and he published many books. For example, The Freedom from Religion in Kant, and his immediate successors, the Vocation of Humankind, 1774 to 1800, and other books. And he also translated many works of Kant, Hegel, Jacobi, and especially he has published the translation of Hegel's Science of Logic in 2010. ジョバンニ先生を簡単にご紹介すると、ジョバンニ先生はカナダのマギル大学の哲学科の教授であられて、ドイツ関連論についてロマン主義も含めてですが研究されています。でたくさん本を出されていますけれども、カントにおけるカントの自由宗教論における自由すみません、カントと、その継承者における宗教論における自由というタイトル、人類の使命という副題で、1770年から1800年を扱った本が大きな本ですけれども有名なものですが、その他にもたくさんの本を出されています。それからカント、ヘーゲル、ヤコービについての著作のたくさんの翻訳も出されていますし、2010年にはカントのヘーゲルの大論理学の翻訳をこれも分厚い本ですが出されたところです。で、今日は、ジョバンニ先生にThe Kant Legacy, Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre and Hegel's Logic というタイトルでご講演いただくことになっています。日本語のタイトルはカントの遺産、フィヒテの知識学とヘーゲルの論理学ということです。ご講演は大体1時間ぐらい予定していまして、その後1時間ぐらい質疑をして、そして、休憩を挟みまして、その後ブレジル先生のご講演に移りたいというふうに思っています。よろしくお願いします。So we have first the lecture of Professor Giovanni about for an hour, and after that we discuss about for an hour, and after that we have 5 or 10 minutes break, and then we'll have the second today's guest speaker, Professor Breazeale. So could you start your presentation, Breazeale?
Okay. First of all, let me thank Professor Irie and the University of Osaka for this invitation. It's truly a pleasure for me and an honor to be here. Dozo yorushika onegai shimasu. This paper is essentially about Fichte. If I bring Hegel conspicuously into the picture, this is only for the sake of contrast, in order to define all the more sharply Fichte's position with respect to Kant. Common wisdom has it that Fichte was the one who, in the reception of the Critique of Reason, remained the closest to his master. Indeed, Kant's legacy is broad enough and in places even ambiguous that a case can be made to that effect, especially if one concentrates and the legacy's moral side. But I want to say that in what counted most in the legacies, it is Hegel who was Kant's true inheritor. I shall presently say what I consider as counting most. I must first make clear that the Fichte I have in mind is post-Jena, notably the Fichte of 1804 onward, the time when Fichte had dropped from his science the idiom of the eye, when Hegel, for his part, had finally made it to the philosophical stage, and a conversation between the two, albeit always at a distance, and perhaps not even ever deliberately intended, was in fact taking shape. The Fichte Hegel had in mind in his criticism was always the author of the early versions of the Wissenschaftslehre. As for Fichte, his primary confrontation was with Schelling, not Hegel, to whom he occasionally only alluded. A conversation was nonetheless taking shape between the two, for whoever their immediate philosophical interlocutor, and Schelling was as much in Hegel's mind as in Fichte's, it was the metaphysics of Spinoza that both, in their contrasting ways, were taking position, and in so doing were also staking their respective claims to the Kantian legacy. That Spinoza should have been the catalyst for sorting out, so to speak. There are differences with respect to Kant might seem strange. But the fact is that because of historical events connected with Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, the figure of Spinoza came to dominate the intellectual scene of the late Enlightenment and continued to dominate it in the subsequent early Romanticism. The net result was that the issue of how to interpret this venerable metaphysician co-opted the reception of Kant. Post-Kantian idealism was born under the large shadow of Spinoza. How one interpreted Spinoza reflected how one intended to build on Kant's legacy. This was, of course, a historical accident. But there was a conceptual appropriateness to it. To turn to what I said counted most in the Kantian legacy, Kant's critical move consisted essentially in defining the possibility of objective experience, that is, of experiential truth, from the standpoint of one who is himself immersed in experience and is, ex hypothesis, unable to step outside it. The error of all prior metaphysics, the metaphysics that Kant dubbed dogmatic, lay precisely in the presupposition that one can perform this step and explain what things are in themselves rather than limit oneself to their presence in experience, that is to say, without abiding by the limits that experience imposes on this presence. Fichte posed the problem of experience in precisely these terms in the 1797 new introduction to his science. As he said, and I quote, "A finite rational being possesses nothing whatsoever beyond experience. These same conditions necessarily apply to the philosopher, and thus it appears incomprehensible how he could ever succeed in elevating himself above experience." End of quote. How can one establish the genesis of objective experience while remaining within it? And the assumption that experience is necessarily directed at a transcendent thing in itself, Kant had dealt with the problem simply by defining the conditions under which that supposed thing in itself is, on the one hand, given to experience, and on the other, recognized in judgment as being so given. Sensibility defined the conditions of being given, conceptual reflection of its recognition. What counted most in Kant's critical project, and also defined his critical legacy, was precisely the requirement that one abide by these conditions alone, that one do not step outside experience. But unfortunately, Kant himself did not necessarily abide by these self-imposed limits. At issue was the robustness of the claim of being given as applied to any object. On Kant's assumption that the thing itself was no more than an empty formal intention, and objectivity therefore purely phenomenal, how could one tell whether the intelligible structures, the coherence of determination by which one recognized object as validly given was indeed truly given? That is, it was more than just a product of the imagination, and science, therefore, not just a fiction, the only in the fact that in experience events de facto occur at random, just as Hume had claimed. The phenomenal objectivity of experience was the issue that precipitated the critical skepticism of Solomon Maimon and Anisidorus Schulze. Kant was making stronger claims about the objectivity of experience than he was entitled to on his very assumptions about the nature of experience. In this, he was stepping outside experience, thus contravening his own critical demand. One can understand, therefore, why Fichte and Hegel staked out their position by criticizing Kant's thing in itself, as well as his a priori, a posteriori dichotomy. Why this criticism, moreover, was motivated by Kant's own critical requirement. One can equally understand why this critical preoccupation could blend in their mind with the further romantic problem of how to speak of the absolute if ex hypothesis there is no space outside it from which to objectify it and thus speak of it. The two concerns seem antithetical. The one, not to step outside experience. The other, how to allow for experience at all in the face of the absolute. But they coincided in that for both, the issue was one of saving the objectivity of experience, of explaining the givenness of it. As Fichte asked in 1797, and I quote, "But what is the basis of the system of representations accompanied by a feeling of necessity?" I gloss, the feeling of being bound to and by another. And what is the basis of this feeling of necessity itself? End of quote. Fichte and Hegel came up with radically different answers to this question. Fichte by means of idealizing constructions, Hegel by a method of logical discourse. At least from 1804 on, Fichte's favorite description of his ideal constructions was that they were a schemata. The term immediately calls to mind Kant's schematism of the imagination, the part of the critique of pure reason for which the Romantics felt special affinity. And there were indeed romantic strains behind it because of the new starting point that Fichte now gave to his science. No science was possible, so Fichte claimed, apart from the assumption that truth is one. It followed that the principle of his science, for which he claimed absolute truth, could be no other than the all one absolute, das all eine Absolute, the only possible source of such a truth. This was, of course, a deliberate spinozistic standpoint, and Fichte well knew the objection that could be raised against it, and which he too raised more than once. In conceiving the absolute as a self-contained and all-encompassing substance in the manner of Spinoza, one begged the question of how one can say anything determinate about it, exactly the criticism that Kant had leveled against all dogmatic metaphysics. To be sure, Spinoza himself, in attributing to the absolute such determinations as thought and extension, had only attributed them to it. To attribute something to anything is only to say this something of it without necessarily claiming that it belongs to it in itself. The absolute determinations were quite explicitly only said of it from the standpoint of a finite intelligence. They were subject to determinations with no strict objective value. But here was the rub. For one cannot use the language of attribution and respect its logic without thereby assuming a space outside the target of attribution from which the attribution is made, the space, in other words, for a subjective standpoint. In Spinoza's case, however, to assume such a space would have been to posit something outside the absolute, hence to limit it externally, hence to contradict the original assumption of an all-encompassing unity. This might not have been a problem for Spinoza himself, because, as Fichte put it, he simply let the subject doing the attribution submerge in the absolute. For this reason, he described Spinoza's as a state of absolute obscurity. After Kant, however, it had to be a problem. Fichte could not even state the first principle of his science without already falsifying it or stating it. And Fichte was aware of the contradiction he was incurring. The task that thus presented itself to him, and which his science had to resolve, was one of developing the language of attribution in such a way that, though directed at the absolute as its object, it would be subjected to it only by negating itself before it. He had to develop it, in other words, as a language that constituted itself by at the same time annulling itself. To revert to the spatial imagery which Fichte, unlike Hegel, favored, this was a way of granting a space outside the absolute while at the same time abolishing it as anything outside it, hence of reducing it to a mere shine, something illusionary. Of course, to accomplish this task did not mean that the original contradiction was thereby resolved. On the contrary, staying with the contradiction was part of Fichte's strategy. His brilliant move was to make the contradiction the immediate object of his science, and the science's goal, not indeed to remove it, for that would have necessitated relapsing into Spinoza's dogmatism, or alternatively, ceasing to speak altogether, but to contain it conceptually. One had to demonstrate that to live with it was to manifest the absolute's presence, and in this sense, to attain objectivity. The science logic was to be one of appearance and illusion, an appearance and illusion which, however, was as such nonetheless true. The imagery of schemata and schematas correspond to Spinoza's language of attribution. A schema is an imaginative construction by virtue of which something is represented, but according to norms and conditions, specific to the construction's medium. Like a metaphor, the schema retains a content of its own, which renders it non-transparent with respect to the object it represents, however idealized and abstractive its production might have been. In this sense, the schema remains as much a free work of the imagination as a conceptual product of reason. Fichte also says that the schema represents its object only at the distance, vicariously, or, to use his favorite term, by deputizing for it, as Stellvertreter. Like the language of attribution, its inner logic is not necessarily that of the intended object in itself. Of course, in normal cases, one can stand outside both schema and schematized object, and is in a position, therefore, to measure their correspondence by comparing them externally. Ex hypothesis, however, this was not possible for Fichte's schema of the absolute's relation to experience, since the one doing the comparison was in the schema. And this was not just a matter of a lack of space outside the absolute from which to do the comparison. How to say coherently from within the schema that there was no such a space, or in what the comparing would mean, that was truly the troubling problem. Fichte faced it by construing a schema of experience relying exclusively on their form as schemas, that is to say, on each being itself by virtue of being other than itself, or again, by each being a nothingness, yet in its nothingness achieving its own reality precisely as a schema. Methodically developed, the schemata formed an overall schematism of experience which represented the latter as itself a schema of the absolute, that is to say, as constituting with respect to it only an illusionary reality unshine. The success of the science depended accordingly on reaching a point at which, as science, it naturally joined actual experience, thus demonstrating that its own nothingness was simply a more reflective form of the nothingness that was experience. How did Fichte absolve this task? His science, in all its various presentations, always began with a demand made on his auditors. In 1804, and there are three versions of the science in 1804, the demand was that they creatively, energetic, imagine themselves at the point between simple unity, which is the absolute domain, and the domain of multiple finite experiences. Fichte indicated the first by capital A, the second by capital X, and the point between the two where they become significantly related by a dot. Thus, 1, A, X, 2, A and X, where X equal X, Y, Z. The content of X, or the capital X, were the particular X, Y, Z, which had been for Kant the objects, respectively, of his three critiques. Fichte further asked his auditors to imagine themselves at the limit point between the two domains, oscillating between the two without letting themselves be submerged into either. To give themselves over to the absolute, the A, would have amounted to renouncing the possibility of conceptualization and consequently falling into unconsciousness. The alternative, given in to the finite, would have been to dogmatically assume the object of experience, and by implication the transcendent absolute, as ready-made things for which one can establish only external relations. Of course, one cannot stay in this state of oscillation. One must speak, thereby revert to conceptual discourse and the determinate object which it brings in train. But for Fichte's auditors, this return to finite experience had to be with a difference, for they now knew that to conceive the absolute critically, one had to conceive it precisely as inconceivable. That even the predicate inconceivable did not really belong to it, but was rather a function of their own thinking, a statement about this thinking of the absolute rather than the absolute itself. Fichte's science was about this statement, about the condition that he had, about the conditions that he had to satisfy as a language which, in speaking about things, in fact, always intended the presence of a transcendent other. This presence was necessarily left unspoken per se, yet, although unspoken, it was not any the less effective, wirklich, for that, since it imparted a completely new meaning to the spoken things. To revert to the spatial imagery of Fichte's overall schema, the science's preoccupation was to hold its ground at the point of oscillation, the dot between A and X. This was a space which Fichte describes as der Lager des Todes, or der Tod im Wurzel, that is, as the source of spiritual death, For it is there that one, unable to withstand its oscillation, runs the risk of falling into the
We'll start second part. The second lecturer is Professor Daniel Breazeale. He is a professor of Department of Philosophy of University of Kentucky. He specializes in German philosophy from Kant to Nietzsche, and especially Fichte. And he also wrote many books and made translation of Fichte's works. And he is a founder of North American Fichte Association and is now president of that association. And of course, he is a leading researcher of the Fichte in North America. So, and we have this lecture. Its title is Against Nature on the Status of Meaning of Natural Works in Johann Gottlieb Fichte's early Wissenschaftslehre. So, could you start your presentation?
Thank you. I too am honored to be here. It's been a long goal of mine to have a chance to come to Japan on a lecture tour, and I am deeply appreciative to Professor Irie and to the University of Osaka, and to you, the audience, for your willingness to come listen to Anglophone speakers talk about German philosophers in Asia. Thank you very much for that. Also, I'd like to express my thanks to my colleague, Giovanni. It's been a pleasure to be doing this with him for the last week. It made it even more of a pleasure. My paper is entitled Against Nature on the Status and Meaning of the Natural World in Fichte's early Wissenschaftslehre. I wish to emphasize that unlike Professor Giovanni, I will be concerned with texts prior to 1800, the early Wissenschaftslehre. My paper consists of 5 parts. The first part is on the nature in relationship to the eye. The second part is upon nature in relationship to the human body. The third part is concerned with nature and evil. The fourth part, the relationship of freedom to nature. And the fifth part, the final end of nature. Again, all in the context of the early or Jena Wissenschaftslehre. So, today,
お招きいただいてどうもありがとうございました。ここで講演できることを大変嬉しく思っていることも大変光栄と思っております。日本に行くのは私にとっても長期目的でした。もうずっと前から日本に行きたかったですけれども、イリエ先生のおかげでこの夢が実現できました。そしてイリエ先生にこれについて深く感謝しております。また皆様に感謝しています。英語の声の聞くの大変だと思いますけれども、最後までお付き合っていただいてもどうもありがとうございます。あとジョバンニ先生にも感謝しています。この1週間一緒に日本を回って講演するのはとても楽しい経験になりました。私のこれからの講演は自然に移行してフィヒテの前期知識学についての講演ですけれども、強調しているのはこれは全部1800年以前の知識学についてのことです。でご覧の通りこの講演は5つの部分に分かれています。それぞれはその自然ともう一つのことについての関係についてですね。全部はイエナ期以前のイエナの時代のフィヒテの 知識学についてです。で、最初はご覧の通りその自我と自然との関係について、で第2部分はその自然と人の体の関係について、で第3部は自然とその本悪についてのことで、第4の部分は自由について、で最後の第5の部分はその最終的目標についてのことです。
Today I will be discussing the conception of nature that emerges from the writings of Fichte's early or so-called Jena period of philosophizing from 1794 to 1800. This may well appear to be an unpromising enterprise, inasmuch as the philosophy of nature, though recognized by Fichte as one of the fundamental systematic divisions of his system, the Wissenschaftslehre, was one that he himself failed to develop. Indeed, he even confessed at one point that he was personally incapable of doing so. One of his own students observed that, quote, he knows nothing about many areas of philosophy, including the deepest grounds of natural science. Whereas another contemporary, Franz Baader, characterized Fichte as a true ignoramus in everything that has to do with physics and nature. And of course, the decisive break between Fichte and his erstwhile disciple, Schelling, came precisely over Schelling's efforts to construct an a priori Naturphilosophie as an independent complement to transcendental idealism. All of this might well seem to justify the widespread impression that Fichte has an entirely negative view of nature and the natural world, understood as a realm utterly opposed to that of subjectivity, a mere hindrance to freedom, which we should strive ceaselessly to abolish as such. Hence, one historian of philosophy has described Fichte's conception of nature as nothing more than a punching bag for our moral energies. Though there is, as we shall see, ample evidence for such an interpretation, it is only part of the story regarding Fichte's unwritten philosophy of nature. His Jena writings contain ample material for developing a far more positive conception of nature and of the relation between the realms of freedom and nature, even if Fichte's project does not countenance the possibility of the kind of a priori Naturphilosophie conceived of by Schelling, Hegel, and the early Romantics. Let us now consider the place of nature in the early Wissenschaftslehre. Part 1. Nature as not I. In its most fundamental sense, nature is understood by the transcendental philosopher as the domain of what is excluded from the I, and thus from the realm of life and of freedom. So understood, nature is a profoundly alien domain, a realm of exteriority, multiplicity, and heteronomy, rather than one of identity, unity, and autonomy. To be sure, there are major differences in how this alien realm is viewed from the theoretical standpoint of cognition and from the practical standpoint of action. From the former, the natural world appears to be the determining ground of our representations and cognitions, a realm in which the cognizing subject invariably loses itself in its objects. From the standpoint of free agency, nature is what is not determined by freedom, but is simply given as subject to a mechanical necessity utterly indifferent to the ends of freedom. As Fichte puts it in his System of Ethics, nature is what is fixed and determined independently of freedom. It is the task of the first foundational portion of Fichte's system, as presented first in his 1794-95 Foundations of the Entire Wissenschaftslehre, and then in a revised and much improved version in his 1796-99 Lectures on the Foundations of Transcendental Philosophy, Wissenschaftslehre, Nova Methode. The task of these texts is to provide a full genetic account of precisely how the I comes to posit for itself an independent and opposing not I, or natural world. According to Fichte's account, the I is to be understood as an original konitos, i.e., as a freely and spontaneously self-positing activity, which encounters an inexplicable limit or check, Anstoß, upon its range of activity. It experiences this check as an immediately given and purely subjective manifold of feeling, Gefühle, in the absence of which it cannot posit itself, schlechthin, at all, in accordance with its own necessary laws of reflection, which characterize the I as an intellect. These originally encountered feelings or sensations are then posited and reposited by the intellect or cognizing I, first as sensible intuitions in space and time, then as representations of features of material objects, etc., until finally, as Fichte puts it, something disengages itself from the I, something which by means of further determination will gradually transform itself by means of what he describes as a dark, unreflected intuition into a universe with all its characteristic features. This, of course, is simply Fichte's radically revised version of Kant's transcendental deduction of the a priori conditions for the possibility of experience, and thus simply a new way of explaining how the understanding can be the lawgiver to nature. This is possible, according to Fichte, because, as he puts it, nature in its entirety is a product of the productive power of imagination. But Fichte's a priori deduction of nature goes well beyond Kant's in two crucial respects. First of all, it includes an a priori account of organic nature, and thus of purely natural teleology, that is, of natural organisms as real wholes, acting in accord with their own immanent ends. Like Kant, in the third critique, Fichte, in his system of ethics, stresses the essential role of the reflective power of judgment in cognizing natural organisms, and indeed nature itself, as an organized and self-organizing system. Unlike Kant, however, Fichte treats such judgments not merely as regulative, as if claims, concerning a natural world that we can truly cognize or know only under mechanical laws, but as constitutive of experience, and thus of the natural world. Fichte's deduction of the systematic or organic structure of nature proceeds from his deduction of the human body as an articulated tool of the will. We are able to understand our own body only as a self-organizing product of nature, which is possible if and only if, by means of our reflective power of judgment, we conceive nature itself as a whole, not only as capable of producing such self-organized and self-organizing real organic wholes, but as actually consisting of the same. As an aspect of nature, organic purposiveness certainly differs from mechanical causation. Nevertheless, it does not entail any genuine freedom on the part of these natural wholes. At most, it is an instance of what Kant called arbitrium brutum, and not genuine self-determination, arbitrium livium. All natural transitions, whether mechanical or organic, are equally, says Fichte, necessary and have their foundation in the laws of nature. They occur without consciousness and therefore without freedom. Nature is thus incapable of bringing about any genuine change within itself. The second major difference between Fichte and Kant with respect to the a priori positing of the natural world pertains to the content of experience. Whereas Fichte treats the manifold of sensibility, whereas Kant treats the manifold of sensibility as something simply given to the eye, apparently inscrutably by the operation of unknowable things in themselves upon the human mind, Fichte, influenced no doubt by Jacobi's critique of the doctrine of things in itself, unequivocally rejects such a picture as an absurdity and insists that it is the task of transcendental idealism to provide a deduction not merely of the spontaneously produced form, but also of the received content of experience. As already noted, he proposes to explain the manifold of subjective feelings with which his deduction of representations commences as the product of a collision between the I's original and spontaneous self-activity and certain inscrutable limits to the same, which are ultimately simply the particular limits of a particular finite I. This is the meaning of the famous and controversial doctrine of the Anstoß, which is simultaneously a check upon the practical activity of the I and an incentive for its theoretical activity to posit for itself, i.e. to become clearly conscious of these same limits. The ultimate upshot of this process of positing on the part of the intellect is its positing of the not I as such, namely as an independently existing natural world in which it happens to find itself. In fact, Fichte's Jena writings contain two rather different accounts of the ultimate origin of the limits encountered by the finite self-positing I. The more ambitious account, to which I will return at the conclusion of my remarks, traces these determinations back to the free and self-determining activity not of the finite I, but of the pure I, or, as Fichte renames it in his lectures on Wissenschaftslehre Nova Methode, the pure will, which is also described in Book 3 of the Vocation of Man as the one eternal being, or God. The alternate strategy, which in my opinion is better in keeping with Fichte's injunction to the transcendental philosopher never to transcend the domain of consciousness itself, is simply to confess one's insuperable ignorance on this point and rest content with a recognition that we are here in the presence of an incomprehensible boundary, a surd element of inexplicable finitude, which not only lies at the foundation of our experience of the natural world, but is at the same time a necessary condition for the very possibility of any freely positing consciousness and self-consciousness. Despite this ambiguity regarding the ultimate origin of such feelings, Fichte is unequivocal in his claim that nature must nevertheless be understood transcendentally as a product of the activity of the I, more specifically, of its absolute power of productive imagination. Nature is what the I posits for itself in its involuntary efforts, as it were, to explain to itself its own originally limited state. Though nature is a product of the activity of the I is not, for reasons explained in the Wissenschaftslehre, originally or ordinarily conscious of this fact. On the contrary, nature is originally experienced by the I as something that is merely encountered or discovered in the course of experience. It is precisely the task of the purely theoretical portion of the Wissenschaftslehre to explain, says Fichte, how the world is and must be, how the world is given to us. If such results exhaust the realm of theoretical philosophy in the narrower sense, i.e. philosophy of nature, they do not exhaust that of philosophy per se, not to mention that of real life, the principle of which is not knowing, but acting. So let us now consider how nature fares in the context of Fichte's practical philosophy, and how it figures in his account of free, that is, moral action. Part 2, Nature Within Me, the Human Body. From the theoretical standpoint we have just described, nature appears as a realm of passive resistance, utterly distinct from and opposed to the cognizing subject. Just as the characteristic feature of the I is activity, so is that of the not I, inertia, or lack of activity. As Fichte puts it again in his Science of Ethics, System of Ethics, the nature of a thing lies in its fixed subsistence, lacking in any inner movement, passive and dead, and this is what you necessarily posit whenever you posit a thing and its nature, something fixed and unchangeable. This is the nature of a thing, which does not depend upon the thing at all, for a thing is itself its own nature, and its nature is precisely this thing. End quote. From this it follows that the behavior of a natural thing is only a necessary manifestation of its nature, and there is no place here for freedom whatsoever. Nature is the realm of pure objectivity, of mere stuff, in which there is no place for action, as understood by Fichte. Nature simply is, says Fichte, and in no way acts. For, as Kant recognized, in order to conceive of the possibility of genuine or transcendental freedom, one has to imagine a being whose ground lies in something other than another being. a being that is capable of determining itself spontaneously. And if such self-determined freedom is to possess any real Wirksamkeit or efficacy, i.e., if the freedom of the I is to be real, it must, in determining itself, also determine an entirely new chain of events beyond itself. In other words, it must determine occurrences in nature. Beyond being, however, there is only thinking. Free agency thus presupposes the real self-determination of the will by means of thinking, namely by constructing a concept of an end or goal of acting, and then acting upon this concept. But if I am unable, by means of morally motivated free acts, to create or to destroy the real stuff of nature, then how can my actions become wirklich or actual? Fichte's answer to this question is as follows. Even though I cannot create or destroy the basic matter of nature, I am nevertheless able to rearrange and to shape this same matter in accordance with my own freely produced and purely intelligible goal concepts. I can alter the specific constitution or properties of natural things. From this it follows that nature can, and from the standpoint of the Wissenschaftslehre understood as the first system of freedom, must be viewed not merely negatively as the realm that opposes and hinders the freedom of the I, but also more positively as the essential arena of genuine efficacious action. For as Fichte concludes, a person is free only in the sphere in which objects are given to him. A free action is one guided by a freely constructed concept of an end. Such a goal concept presupposes cognition of the natural world as it is given to us, and then posits a different state of the same world, not as it is, but as it ought to be. The whole point of a freely self-determined concept of an end of action is precisely to determine some future state of nature. Nature is thus a necessary condition for the very possibility of free action. The will itself is purely intelligible and is, as such, quite incapable of acting in the world. It is only as embodied that it can achieve its practical aim. In order to act upon and within the natural world of material stuff, I must be stuff as well. This is why, according to Fichte, the finite I is always a materially embodied will. Viewed as a principle of efficacy in the natural world, I am not simply materially embodied, but I possess a distinctively articulated body. That is to say, a body capable of executing in myriad ways various possible dictates of the will. My representation of my body is not simply a way of positing a particular portion of nature. Instead, it is a representation of myself as a free cause in the world of bodies, and therefore, says Fichte, only a certain way of looking at my own absolute activity, through the lens, as it were, of what is given to me as my own nature, my articulated body. Long quotation. The will of the person enters the realm of the sensible world only insofar as it is expressed in a determination of his body. Thus, in the sensible realm, the body of a free being is to be regarded as itself the final ground of its own determination, and the free being, as an appearance, is identical with its body. This body is the I's representative in the sensible world, and where only the sensible world is being considered, the body is the I itself. End of quotation. Nature is therefore not only outside, but also within me, first in the form of a natural drive to self-preservation and enjoyment, which, along with the pure drive toward complete Selbstständigkeit or independence from external influences, constitutes one half of what Fichte calls the original drive of the finite I. But insofar as I am free and self-sufficient, I distinguish myself from this, my own natural drive, as from something objective within me. and hence I experience this drive as a mere longing, Sinn, which I am free to satisfy or not to satisfy. If, however, I decide to satisfy my natural drive, it then becomes mine in a stronger sense than before, as something I have freely posited and appropriated, both theoretically and practically. Whenever I decide to satisfy a prompting of my natural drive, this is because of a free self-determination to do so, which is not something that can occur in consequence of a simple force of nature. This is how Fichte proposes to avoid the problems associated with Kant's third identity of pure reason and the relationship between the opposed realms of freedom and nature. Since the I's original drive contains both a pure and a natural drive, and since the latter is itself a product of nature, my efficacy in the natural world is, so to speak, assured in advance. Were we not natural beings, in this sense, it would be impossible to understand how it would be possible for us to act within the natural world. My natural drive is thus to be understood as nature within me, by virtue of which I am able to affect nature outside me, which is what occurs when this nature within me, i.e. my natural drive, is guided by a freely designed concept of an end. Meanwhile, as the Wissenschaftslehre demonstrates, the I must always posit nature, whether external or internal to itself, as filling space. Hence, this system of nature within me is posited as a material body, which is, on the one hand, immediately subject to the will, and, on the other, related to and capable of exercising a causal influence upon other material bodies in the natural world. Fichte's truly revolutionary claim is that such an articulated material body is a condition for the very possibility of free self-positing, and therefore of I-hood itself. Without such a body, moral obligation could be no more than a certain way of thinking, and not of acting. Acting is possible only in the natural world, even though nature itself, as we have observed, is incapable of genuine action. With respect to its content, every action is related to the natural drive, since even our freely chosen goals must be related to the natural world, with which we are in contact only by means of our body and the system of our natural drives. The human body is thus the indispensable instrument of all perception and cognition, as well as the vehicle of all causality. In order to serve as such an instrument, however, the same body must also be an organized and self-organizing whole, that is to say, an organism. And it is from this conclusion that Fichte then proceeds to derive, by means of the reflective power of judgment, the previously mentioned organic dimension of nature itself, apart from the human body. So conceived, nature is not simply a realm of material stuff, but is a realm of natural, law-like alteration, albeit not of genuine intentional action. Nevertheless, says Fichte, before I can alter myself by means of an act of self-determination, I must already have been altered. There must therefore exist some sort of intermediary thing, which we call nature, some sort of force or principle of activity, by means of which I alter myself independently of my freedom and without any consciousness of my self-determination. Though the highest drive, the insatiable drive of the I toward absolute self-sufficiency, is not a natural one, its goal can be approximated only by means of acting efficaciously, that is, only within the material natural world. The preservation and cultivation of the human body as an indispensable tool of the will is therefore a moral demand. And as we shall see, the same applies to the cultivation of nature beyond the human body. Not only is the body an absolutely essential instrument of the will, through which alone it can bring about those changes in the natural world that duty demands, it is also essential for that process of mutual recognition described in Fichte's Foundations of Natural Right. For it is only by recognizing the freedom of the other in the distinctive shape and behavior of his organized body, and through his speech as well, that I am able to recognize his summons upon me to limit my own freedom, and thus to posit myself as an individual, which, according to Fichte, is the only way I I can actually posit myself at all. Thus, here again, we arrive at the same conclusion as before. No natural material body, no absolute self-positing on the part of the I. Part 3. Nature, inertia, and the radical evil in human beings. It is in reference to this natural dimension of the finite I that Fichte proposes to account for the troubling fact that we do not, in fact, always act in accordance with the dictates of the pure will, and thereby to explain our failure to act morally. Moral failing, he maintains, is always a sin, a sign that one has failed to cultivate a clear consciousness of the demands of the moral law, that is, of one's pure drive, and has thus remained at a lower, purely natural level of reflection. However, many people can be expected to remain at this level, but why? This expectation, according to Fichte, is based on the empirical observation that most people are simply too lazy to cultivate the requisite moral consciousness. Hence, the radical evil in human beings is for Fichte just another name for an original laziness or inertia, Trägheit, with respect both to their reflections and to what follows therefrom, acting in accordance with one's reflections. For Fichte, however, we do not need to rest our case simply upon empirical observations of human inertia, for there is a deeper, transcendental explanation for the same, namely the inertia of nature itself. As you will recall, this is the fundamental difference between the I and the not I. Only in the former is there any real change or action. Nature, in Fichte's view, is a realm of passivity. Consequently, it is precisely because of man's necessary natural drive, precisely because of the dependence of the will's efficacy upon a material, natural human body, that human beings are, as it were, congenitally affected by the inertia of nature itself, predisposed, as it were, to laziness and thus to evil. Even after they have been animated by freedom, our natural forces still retain a tendency to retain the direction originally given to them by nature, and thus are affected by the inertia of nature itself, and have a tendency to remain on the habitual track. This is why every human being, even the most active one, must constantly struggle against the original force of inertia within his own nature. To the extent that we too are natural creatures, we too are creatures of habit. To be sure, it is Fichte's central claim that we ought to tear ourselves free from this natural state of inertia, since, in accordance with our original pure being as I's, we are free and self-active and independent of nature, and thus we must be capable of resisting the secondary forces of our own nature. Here, however, we appear to be caught in a circle. In order to tear ourselves loose from our natural inertia, we must exercise our free will, and yet it is this very freedom that appears to be fettered by the force of natural inertia. And indeed, according to Fichte, if we did not have the moral law as a counterweight, we would in fact never be able to tear ourselves free in the manner demanded by the demands of morality. But here again, it is difficult to understand how one can, through a sheer act of willing, lift oneself to a clearer consciousness of the demands of the moral law. Is this not yet another circle? If we consider human beings purely in terms of their natural endowments, it appears to be impossible to grasp how one could ever overcome one's own natural inertia. Consequently, if such an act of self-liberation is to be possible at all, it is not naturally possible. Instead, says Fichte, it emerges absolutely, Shakti, from a person's self-activity. Viewed in purely natural terms, it seems that a human being is simply incapable of morality, and thus, as Fichte puts it, only a miracle can save him, albeit one that he himself must perform. Thus, though our nature can explain our failure both to recognize the moral law and to act in accordance with it, nature cannot explain our ability to act freely within the world. Part 4. The practical dominion of reason over nature. Viewed in the light of our practical, and more specifically, our moral ends, the natural world is nothing other than the necessary arena of moral striving that was referred to, the only domain in which our freely constructed ends can ever be realized and therefore necessary for the purposes of reason. Here, of course, I am referring to our proximate ends, since our ultimate end has finite eyes. Total self-sufficiency is, as Fichte emphasizes, one that can never be realized, even in principle, since that would involve abolishing the not-I, and along with it, the self-positing I. All we can actually do is to strive endlessly toward this unobtainable goal. So viewed, nature is not something that should be overcome or abolished as incompatible with the freedom of the I. Instead, it represents that complement of finite I-hood as a domain in which alone freedom can be actualized. In order to view myself as a freely active being, I must view the natural world as modifiable through freedom, and, as we have seen, ascribe to myself a body that is determinable by my will in accordance with the freely constructed goal concepts by means of which I can form and modify nature. Our task is therefore not to overcome nature, but to cultivate it. This is one of Fichte's favorite themes, especially in his more popular writings, to exhort us to place our natural powers in the service of our moral ideals, which means that we should set to work making the natural world a more commodious home for human beings and their ends, and should employ our scientific knowledge of nature as a tool for modifying it in accordance with our concepts of how it ought to be. Note how this practical perspective on nature provides us with a radically new insight into the character of the same. No longer is nature viewed simply as a passive, dead realm of unchangeable stuff, which merely thwarts the end of the free subject, nor as a realm of externally cognizable objects related to one another according to natural laws. On the contrary, nature now appears to the eye as an infinitely modifiable, originally given stuff external to ourselves. By originally given, Fichte here simply means necessarily posited by thinking itself to its very form. But here the emphasis is upon the fact that it is only in relation to the practical efficacy of the I that this natural world is originally given to us in the first place. Long quotation. Our consciousness proceeds from and immediately given consciousness of our own activity, and we find ourselves to be passive only by means of the latter. It is not the not-I that acts efficaciously upon the I, which is how this issue has customarily been viewed, but the other way around. The not-I does not intrude upon the I, but the I goes out into the not-I. We are therefore once again, and in a still higher sense, claiming the primacy of reason insofar as it is practical. Everything proceeds from acting, and from the acting of the I. The I is the first principle of all movement and of all life, of every deed and occurrence. If the not-I exercises an effect upon us, this does not occur within the domain of the not-I. It operates efficaciously by means of resistance, Widerstand, which it could not do if we had not first acted upon it. It is not the not-I that encroaches upon us, but we who encroach upon it. With this realization, nature now appears to us being transcendental philosophers, as what it most truly is, according to Wissenschaftslehre, i.e., as the indispensable domain of actual human freedom, the sole realm in which those ends demanded by moral duty can actually be realized. As such, it is everyone's duty to employ the objects one encounters in nature, and indeed to employ nature as a whole for one's own moral ends. Though for Fichte, this does not mean one's particular ends as a natural being, but rather the ends of reason itself, or pure willing, or I-hood as such, as these are related to one's particular, naturally determined situation. From this general thesis, Fichte deduces not only a series of concrete duties with regard to our own bodies and those of others, but also the institution of private property, which is based on the demand that one respect natural things that others have previously modified in accordance with their ends. My freedom is not infringed upon by the particular circumstances in which I happen to find myself in the natural world, nor by the fact that another rational being outside of me provides me with my first sphere of freedom by summoning me physically to limit my freedom out of recognition of his. These are conditions for the very possibility of freedom, not impediments to the same. Nor is my freedom limited by the existence of a realm of rational spiritual beings outside me, since as moral beings, we are all united by and share the same pure will, and thus all finite eyes, in Fichte's view, share the same final end with respect to the natural world, namely, quote, that reason alone should have dominion in the sensible world, that all physical force should be subordinated to reason, and that the entire sensible world ought to come under the dominion of reason. This means that everything in nature ought to become the property of someone, since only then can it be purposively his. These two commands, that everyone work to improve the utility not only of his own but also the other's property, and that everything be someone's property, are particularly important for establishing dominion over the dominion of reason over the natural world. The first command unifies reason so that it becomes one in the minds of all, no matter how much we may differ empirically. Hence it affirms the universality of the moral law. The second command serves to comprehend and to grasp nature under this single unified will. Reason is at one with itself, concludes Fichte, and the sensible world is subordinated to it. This is the end that has been set for us. From this it directly follows that nature itself and purely natural beings possess, on Fichte's view, no moral standing, nor rights whatsoever, insofar as all moral actions must refer, directly or indirectly, to rational beings and their drive toward freedom for its own sake. And, says Fichte, just as there are no rights with regard to non-rational nature, so too are there no duties regarding nature. Instead, it is our duty to fashion or to shape nature, but again, only for the sake of the ends of rational beings. Yet even though reason's final end is the unity of all finite wills and the complete dominion of reason over the natural world, the accomplishment of, or rather advancement toward, this end of reason always remains the task of individual human beings engaged in determinate actions in the world. This, therefore, is precisely what the morally good person wills. Fichte says, you first discover yourself as a product of the sensible world, chained to it because of your weakness, an immortal being in need of what is only dust and ash. There is only one way to free yourself from this condition, elevation to pure morality, and you are destined, it is your vocation, to take this path. From the moment you set out upon this path, nature, which was hitherto your governess, becomes subject to you and is transformed into your passively obedient instrument. Here Fichte, as a true child of the Enlightenment, was supremely confident that this necessary aim of reason, namely dominion over nature, is one that will eventually be achieved. In Book 3 of The Vocation of Man, he therefore describes as follows the way that nature appears to a person resolved to heed to dictates of morality, namely as something in need of improvement. I do not feel at home in the present, nor feel at ease there for a moment. My whole life, such a person says, incessantly flows toward a future, better state of things. To be sure, Fichte observes, mankind still toils to wring its existence from a recalcitrant nature, and immortal spirits have to direct their energies to figuring out how to do this. Weather ruins crops, floods and storms devastate communities, diseases plague populations. Yet it cannot be true that this situation cannot be improved. For, this is typical Fichte peroration, no work that bears the imprint of reason and was undertaken to expand the power of reason can be completely lost in the course of the ages. This resistance must gradually become weaker and finally be exhausted, since there can be nothing in the lawful advance that might renew its strength. That formation must finally be complete and our destined home be finished. Nature must gradually enter a condition that allows one to calculate and reckon safely on its regular pace, and which keeps its force steady in a definite relation with the power that is destined to control it, the power of man. In this way, nature is to become ever more transparent to us until we can see into its most secret core, and human power, enlightened and armed by the discoveries of science, shall control nature without effort and peacefully maintain our conquest once it is made. Section 5. This is the last section. The final end of nature. Illuminated by the light of freedom, not only our own bodies, but the entire world of nature is transfigured. As we know, the natural world is posited as a domain of all that is not I, a realm that is, according to Fichte, posited only in order to explain the limitedness of the I, and hence it receives all its determinations only through opposition to the I. But the most distinctive predicate of the I is not its limited state qua finite I, but precisely its freedom. And this is not adequately reflected in any of the preceding views of nature. It is, however, reflected in nature when viewed from a still higher philosophical standpoint, i.e., insofar as we consider not merely the laws of our intellect, but our freedom itself as a theoretical principle for the determination of our world. From this new and higher perspective, there can be no ultimate conflict between the determining principles of theoretical and practical reason. Instead, we can now see that the same law of freedom, the moral law, through which we determine our actions practically, can also be viewed as a continuation and expression of the same underlying law, which, as a theoretical determining principle, allows us to constitute the natural world in which we are also enjoined to act in accordance with duty. Thus, instead of distinct laws of theoretical and practical reason, there is but a single underlying law of reason. The implications of such a hypothesis are dramatic, as Fichte himself explains. Were this conjecture, that is, the conjecture that a part of the world we find is determined by freedom as a theoretical principle, to be confirmed, and were it to turn out that it's precisely this part of the world that constitutes the sphere of the objects of our duties, then it would follow that the law of freedom, which addresses consciousness as a practical law, will only be a continuation of what that same law, as a theoretical principle, had already initiated, though without any consciousness thereof on the part of the intellect. This law would have determined by itself the sphere over which it has dominion. It could not assert anything in its current capacity as a practical principle that it had not already asserted in its previous one as a theoretical one. Seen in the light of this conjectured harmony between freedom and nature, it becomes possible to consider natural things in terms of their true, final ends, which is not at all the same as their unfreely assigned natural ends as purposive organic wholes. The proper end of any natural object in the sensible world lies in its unique ability to serve as an appropriate means or tool for the finite eye's advance toward the accomplishment of reason's final end. Absolute independence from anything outside of the eye. Absolute self-sufficiency of the eye. Thus, when I reflect simultaneously upon both my freedom and my original limitations, i.e., when I reflect upon a naturally given object in the light of my dutiful goals, I thereby obtain insight into the true purpose of that object, namely, its usefulness for certain freely chosen ends that I might set for myself with regard to it. In this manner, says Fichte, I am able to determine the inner qualities of the thing in a state of repose in relation to my moral drive, which is itself in motion, inasmuch as I am now engaged in moral deliberation for the purpose of acting in the world. And when I have completely determined my concept of the thing, by grasping not only all of its sensible properties, but also its relation not merely to variously arbitrarily chosen human ends, but rather to the end of reason as such. When all this occurs, then I am aware of the full range of its end, that is to say, of its final end. This view of natural objects contrasts sharply with my original, purely theoretical conception of the same, inasmuch as this same natural object, the not I, was previously viewed, i.e. with respect purely to my cognition of it, as actively determining my representations, and the cognizing I was previously viewed as passively limited and determined by nature. What has now been derived is a concept of the ultimate end or purposiveness of a natural object in relation to the ends of reason or freedom as such, and not merely its relation to my ends as an individual. If I am only obscurely or partially conscious of my own drive as such, or in general, that is to say, of my pure drive, or of pure willing, or of pure reason within me, then I will have only a partial and one-sided consciousness of the final purpose of the object in question, and may very well assign it an arbitrary end, rather than use it for its proper one. The aim of my pure drive, and hence of my moral drive, which is simply the pure drive in relationship to the natural drive, is to repeat the complete self-sufficiency and independence of reason or I-hood as such, and thus the absolute dominion of reason over nature. Until I have clearly grasped this, I have not fully grasped either myself or the things of nature. But once I have grasped the central truth, then I have also grasped the truth about both myself and the natural world. And in doing so, I am now in a position to view all the objects contained in the latter, and indeed reason as a whole, in terms of their inspec, or final end. The aim of the original drive, when apprehended in its totality, is the absolute self-sufficiency of the I. The way to discover the material content of the moral law is by synthetically uniting the concept of finite I-hood and the concept of absolute self-sufficiency. I am supposed to be self-sufficient. This is my final end. I am supposed to use things in a way that will increase this self-sufficiency. This is their final end. A complete cognition of a natural object thus goes well beyond the kind of purely theoretical cognition of a characteristic of the natural sciences. To be sure, it includes all that is included in the latter, but it also includes a practically mediated cognition of the final end of this same object. Indeed, Fichte claims that a particular moral conviction cannot be sanctioned by conscience until it includes an insight into the final end of the thing, its purposiveness for the freely prescribed ends of reason. In this manner, the principles of morality, the pure will, the drive to utter self-sufficiency, what Kant called practical reason, and Fichte often calls the pure I. In this manner, this principle acquires an objective reality and meaning far different from what it had previously acquired. For now it can be understood as the source not only of the form of the moral law, understood in the Fichtean manner as a specific command to act in this way or that in a specific concrete situation, but also as a source of the content of the same, inasmuch as practical reason, understood now as a theoretically determining principle of the natural world, would have originally provided itself with the matter, or determinate content of the general law, i.e. the objects of nature, along with their final ends. This is why Fichte can boast that with this last step, we have arrived at the ultimate point of the origin of all reason. Were all of this confirmed, this hypothesis, then the principle of morality would acquire a reality and objective meaning entirely different from what has previously been maintained. And the question raised above, namely, where do the objects for the required activity come from, and what is their principle of cognition, would be answered. The principle of morality would itself be both a theoretical and a practical principle. In the former capacity, it would provide itself with the matter, the determinate content of the moral law, and in the latter, it would give itself the form of the law, the command. This principle would revert into itself, would stand in reciprocal interaction with itself, and from a single starting point, we could obtain a complete and satisfying system. Something outside of us would have the final end that it has, because we ought to treat it in a certain way, and we ought to treat it in this manner because it has this final end. We would have found both the idea we would have found both the idea we have been seeking, that is, the idea of what we ought to do, and the substrate in which we ought to approximate the realization of this idea, namely nature itself, as originally determined by the pure will. What this amounts to is nothing less than a radical recasting of the results of the first Kantian critique in the light of those of the second and third ones, which is, I submit, the program of the entirety of the Wissenschaftslehre. This new conception of the relation of nature to freedom directly implies that the possibility of satisfying the moral law is here bound to be determined not by any foreign principle lying outside of the law heteronomously, but by the moral law itself autonomously. We can therefore reject in advance any suggestion that it might ultimately prove to be impossible to carry out the proximate and concrete demands of the moral law, since this possibility is, as it were, hardwired into the original constitution of nature. With such speculations, we have moved beyond the domain of both theoretical philosophy and ethics into that of philosophy of religion. The discipline that, according to Fichte, deals with the postulate that practical philosophy addresses to the theoretical realm, to nature, which by means of a supersensible law is supposed to accommodate itself to the end of morality, which is none other than that of reason itself. But this same move also raises a series of new questions concerning the ultimate ground of the postulated harmony of nature and freedom. In the Wissenschaftslehre Novo Methodo and elsewhere, Fichte describes this ultimate ground as the pure will, understood as the final link in the ever-ascending chain of syntheses which constitute its genetic derivation of ordinary experience and self-consciousness. This pure will is just another name for the pure I introduced in paragraph 1 of the foundations of the entire Wissenschaftslehre as that unitary whole within which a further distinction is made between the finite and infinite will. Excuse me, finite I and the finite not I. In the system of ethics, the same pure will is identified with reason itself as present within the finite I in the form of a pure drive. And in the 1798 essay, on the basis of our belief in the moral governance of the world, this same ultimate ground of harmony between freedom and nature is described as the moral world order, a providential, harmonious, law-like structure of reality as a whole. In a concluding remark as editor of the Philosophical Journal, Fichte goes even further and maintains that it is both true and philosophically demonstrable that the assumption of a purposiveness, which is not at all the same as a mere regularity within nature, presupposes the assumption that there is a rational creator of nature. This conclusion is made even more explicit in Book 3 of the Vocation of Man, in which Fichte claims not only that a conscientious moral agent must recognize and believe in the existence of a divine law governing both the sensible and supersensible worlds, but also in the existence of a sublime infinite will, or divine lawgiver, who not only promulgates the moral law, but is also the ultimate source of both the limited finite I, and hence of the natural world, and of the entire spiritual world order, as well as the mediator between the two. It is this eternal one, he insists, who speaks to us through the voice of conscience. And even in the system of ethics, i.e. 2 years earlier, Fichte had noted that the idea of the necessary dominion of the moral law within nature and of the purposiveness of that law with respect to nature is one that can be adequately realized only in the idea of Godhead, though this, he adds, is something we need not discuss here. Near the end of his system of ethics, Fichte presents his vision of a purely secular church, understood as a social institution for promoting and preserving clear awareness of a genuinely moral disposition among human beings. This Fichtean church possesses neither holy scriptures nor theoretical doctrine. Its creed is a purely practical one and is expressed through an ever-changing array of symbols, the basic meaning of which remains always the same, namely, that there is something or other that is supersensible and elevated above all nature. It is evident that we have now traversed a very long road indeed, from the bare view of nature as the domain of the not I, a realm opposed and antithetical to human freedom, to a conception of nature as a realm that exists only to be shaped and cultivated by physically embodied human beings, while possessing no real moral significance or meaning in its own right, to a final affirmation of the ultimate harmony between what Leibniz called the realms of nature and of grace. Fichte's final word on this topic, at least as far as the early Wissenschaftslehre is concerned, is perhaps best encapsulated in the following lines from On the Basis of Our Belief in a Moral Governance of the World, with which I too shall conclude. The sensible world proceeds peacefully along its own path, in accordance with its own eternal laws, in order to constitute a sphere for freedom. But it exercises not the least influence upon morality or immorality, and it has no power over a free being. Autonomous and independent, the latter soars above all nature. The world is nothing more than our own inner action, qua pure intellect, made visible to the senses, in accordance with comprehensible laws of reason, and limited by incomprehensible boundaries within which we simply find ourselves to be confined. This is what is asserted in the theoretical portion of transcendental philosophy. Granted, the origin of these boundaries is incomprehensible, but, replies practical philosophy, what is it that bothers you about this? Nothing is clearer or more certain than the meaning of these boundaries. They constitute your determinate place in the moral order of things. Our world is the material of our duty made sensible. This is the truly real element in the things, the true basic stuff of all appearance. The compulsion with which belief in the reality of the world forces itself upon us is a moral compulsion, the only kind of compulsion